Suraj, is it just me or
No,
Suraj?
we lost Suraj between. I think he's dropped out.
Probably joined from another account.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, just a quick note on perhaps the need to emphasize participatory methods for program design. And I think I went over it a little fast because I assumed some things, I think, which I should not have assumed. And so Rahul said that he might follow up with the Vikramshila team separately to see whether you can have a session or something outside of this set of sessions, because he is based there. That might be something useful to do, and we could also note it for something that we can do together in the second set. The workshop in Kolkata, right? Hopefully early next year. But I did think that it's worth trying to get a little bit into whatever is the PRA equivalent, which would work for your field sites, for your interventions. So that's just one thing to mention. Second is just to reiterate the two very interesting programs that Shubhra had mentioned last time that Vikramshila has done in the past. So again, let's take a note of that, because one of the things we are seeing in the TOCs that many of you are uploading is that we need to do some more work, in trying to look at the arrows, basically. I think, Naini, as you summarized it last time, right? Getting the arrows right in terms of what we imagine a program to look like and the justification. So I think we had an interesting one from Seema and from Namrata, if I see the latest round of uploads. But I think many of you are still, and maybe Vaishali also, but many of you are still to, I think, complete that. So we'll talk about that, but we don't want to let it go because we do think that, trying to apply our discussions of theory of change to something of interest to each of you would be, So Namrata, I mean, if there's time, we could actually pick up yours or Seema's or to actually discuss. Let's see. Yeah, but just to repeat the plea to others to not give up, not to leave it at a simple logic model, but to get into this. So that's one. Third is, if you remember, we had ended last session by saying now we should try to do the implementation plan for the theory of change, right? That I think didn't happen, so we'll talk about it at the end of today's session. So we'll finish at 6:30, Nani, keeping to what you had requested. But let's not give up on that either. If you recall, in the last session, we had looked at the kind of 7-part, implementation plan of TAL, at least according to that article by Rukmini Banerjee and Madhav Chavan, right? And we had looked at what appears to be linear, just to refresh your memories on that, and how, in fact, there are interesting feedback loops, right? So the idea was that to take that idea, remember that is the input to output space, right? And it's not as simple as saying, here are the inputs, here are the activities, and here are the outputs, right? Nothing is as linear as that. That's a holistic when we say inputs, activities, outputs. And putting a broad arrow from inputs to activities to output doesn't qualify as arrow in the sense in which we meant it, right? The way in which we meant the arrow, as we discussed last couple of sessions, was to show how one thing actually leads to the other, rather than assume a broad, ye karenge to ye hoga. But what makes me think that something leads to something, right? So the idea was to try to apply that to the implementation space for whichever thing you had taken for the TOC. So we'll come back to this. So I think even if some of you have not had the chance to try out some of these, I think we are sort of keen to not let them go, we can revisit, and as and when you can, maybe do that. So that's the one other quick comment I wanted to make. Let me just, before I hand it to Ditya, just go back to that last slide that we had ended with. Nani, I think you need to do the participant sharing. Yes. So if you recall, this was the set of things which was mentioned in the Banerjee Chavan article, right? And we had gone through the various possible feedback loops. So what appeared to be linear: assess level, make student groups, design activities for each group, design progress indicators, then actually do the activities and track the progress. We saw that there were interesting loops. This is what we had discussed. And I think we had run out of time at that point, and I just asked, are there other feedback loops? It's something to think about. And so any application of this kind of logic to any program, you'll find that once you start listing it, as you would in terms of inputs and activities, you'll find that actually the arrows are not as linear as they look. Right? I just wanted to remind us that that was the main point that I tried to convey by taking this TAL example. Yeah. So just want to pause there to check whether there are any questions on that. So remember, in case the terminology and so on gets a little confusing, the theory of change is the overarching one, right? From the get-go of the intervention, the inputs, the activities, the implementation space, to what we've been calling the social process space, right? Outside of the direct control of the implementation, might have to do with children's behavior, might have to do with parents' attitudes, parents' interests, right? Many things, teachers, things which we cannot directly control, especially in terms of behaviors, beliefs, and so on, right? But all of that in a typical complex intervention, all of that is part of the program, right? That's the space of output to outcome. That's what we've been discussing last couple of sessions. So once we did that, we were doubling back to the first part, and we were calling that the implementation plan, right? And so this set of 6 things here, derived from that Banerjee Chavan article, was basically the set of activities, you could say. So this is only still the implementation space, correct? So one way to think about it is it's a subset of a full theory of change. It's a subset in the sense it is the input to output space. Dritya today will continue, taking us through this space, looking at particular indicators to monitor implementation, right? Yes, Atanu, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I missed the last session, but this particular feedback loop, what you are presenting here, it is why it is linear. It should be cyclic, I think, because all these stages, again, after a completion of all these stages, again we will assess,
Yeah.
and this cycle will repeat. Actually, it is cyclic, not linear. So that is
Yes.
the point.
Yes. Totally agreed, Atanu. In fact, that's what we spent time on the second half of last session. So did you say you missed that, right? Or you missed part of it? Maybe that's, yeah. So absolutely fair comment. So if you go back to the recording, that's exactly how we handled this, exactly as you're saying. So what we did was to first put up the set of activities which look linear. If you read the Banerjee Chavan piece, I think which was circulated to you, right, that PDF, you will see that they put it like this: first, second, third, fourth. And so that's what we did. We put that, and then we said there are, well, what you're calling cyclical, right? I was using the term loops, right? And so those are the loops here, Atanu, that these are the ones we discussed last time.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so there could be loops and there could be entire cycle also, what you're saying. That also was discussed. I think a couple of others mentioned that. So absolutely. But the whole point is, that's the movement from a logic model kind of thing, which is a listing, to the arrows, right? And those arrows needn't be linear. Exactly your point. Yeah. So so maybe when you get a chance, just go back to that recording, because we had
Sure, I'll do.
we had a quick discussion of exactly this. In some sense, it was incomplete because which was my last slide. Other feedback loops ? Meaning, I had singled out 3, 4. I think one or two more which some other participants mentioned. There's still more possibilities, right? So okay, so that's where we had left off. I just wanted to take a few minutes and finish off this bit. So here on the left, I have it's just the same 6 things. Okay, I just listed them here. Right, assess the learning levels, make the groups, and so on. And here on the right, I've put some things which were not there in the listing of these 6, which is, how do you identify resources? How do you recruit people, right? In a sense, that's bread and butter of implementation. So that was not there in the activities per se, but for every set of activities, as you very well know as implementers, there's a meta set of activities in order to do these, right? To do with resources, to do with human relations, awareness of context. So so there are many other things that we can discuss when we think of implementation plan. So the particular implementation plan with these 6 things on the left, which we had discussed last time, coming from that Banerjee Chavan piece, were only activities assuming that many other organizational aspects are taken care of, right? But typically when you make an implementation plan, you can't separate these two. That's just pointing something out. And now I'm going to end with a longish quote, which I hope you will enjoy. This is from Albert Hirschman. I think I had mentioned briefly, that. So Albert Hirschman was a development scholar, you could say, from way back, from the 60s and 70s, and he's written lots of very interesting takes on development. So in the late 60s, he wrote 3 books, looking at global kind of projects around the world. He also visited our part of the world, Latin America, and so on. So here's a little quote to set us going on implementation and this planning for implementation. This is from his book called Development Projects Observed. All these books are now fairly easily accessible as PDFs. So this is a longish quote, and I'm just going to read this, okay, to cap off our discussion of implementation before Dvitya takes it up to indicators. Yeah. So just please read with me. The term project conjures up the notion of a set of blueprints prepared by consulting engineers. He's talking about infrastructure projects, but we can think of education curriculum designers instead of engineers, right? Prepared by consulting engineers, which upon being handed to a contractor, think of it as to a teacher or something in our context, will be transformed into 3-dimensional reality within a reasonable time period. Some types of projects come fairly close to this concept. Others, however, are of a completely different nature and are poorly described by the word project, which implies far more certainty and knowledge than is available. Similarly, the term implementation understates the complexity of the task of carrying out projects that are affected by a high degree of initial ignorance and uncertainty. Here, project implementation may often mean, in fact, a long voyage of discovery in the most varied domains, from technology to politics. I don't know if this appeals to you. I just love that last bit. It's a long voyage of discovery. But we often chop it up into neat plans, right? With blueprints. And the image he conjures up in the first part of this like we have scientized the whole thing, people in lab coats coming and, while what he's saying is that completely understates the complexity of the task. And so there's often this danger with this logic model and this and that, as if we have tamed this untamable kind of, the surprising thing called, in his case, development, or in our case, education or learning. And so, it is not working too well today. Yeah, but I just wanted to underscore this, and that in fact it is a long voyage of discovery, and therefore in good implementation plans there have to be the serious loops and those serious possibilities for change embedded into it. Now, often the donor space or even within our organizations, we start too much believing in all these chopped up outputs and activities and models, logic models. And so it's just a plea to keep this voyage of discovery element alive in a world where that's frowned upon, right? I think now in the practice of development and education, this set of blueprints idea that he says at the beginning seems to be a reality. So so keep that in mind, because now we are going to move again to indicators and so on, what we'll be discussing. But all of that is within a larger field, which does not have the certainty that all this seemingly scientific kind of language and measures and so on might suggest. I hope we can have an interesting discussion around it. Not everybody might agree with this. I happen to agree with this quote of Hirschman, so I'm putting it up. But I think it's there's others. This could be something to discuss as well. But with that, I'm just going to close this and pass it on to Dhrutia. Yeah.
Thanks, Suraj. I think the last quote kind of brings me right to the dilemma with which I started sort of thinking about this particular session altogether. Because I think the whole should we measure, what should we measure, what do we monitor thing is it's so debated. In just in the sector, it's really, really debated. And I have a particular standpoint from which I come to this, and I think obviously we'll go into it based on. I try to look at it as a balanced standpoint. Let's see though. Right. So today we will be looking at monitoring indicators and systems. Broadly, this flows right from what we've discussed in the previous session, which is implementation, right? So we went from thinking about a program, a project, from the design idea, us finding out what are the needs that we're trying to address, what is the outcome that we're hoping to have a change on, to then saying, how do you match a program to this particular change that we would like to see? And then we went on to sort of thinking about all the other things with the theory of change, all the other many variables or just life that comes in the way of us implementing these programs. And now I think we'll talk about something that I feel possibly a lot of us are doing for quite a bit of our lives, especially everybody on this call. I know I have done monitoring for several programs for many years. So this kind of tends to become the thing that we do often. So let's sort of get into it, right? Essentially, I think we'll just look at how do we design, develop indicators for the things that we do. How do we integrate monitoring into, as a full part of implementation as well, and not think of it as something that's an additional part, additional to implementation. And then what do we learn from monitoring, right? So no information really is useful if we're not learning from it. So then how do you think about all the monitoring data that we end up collecting, and what do we do with that information? right? So I'm just going back to a slide that I think Suraj used in the first or second session about how do we look at um, what's really the distinction between monitoring and evaluation as we see it, right? And I think primarily what's important is monitoring is something that we do internally. The people who are part of program design, who are part of program implementation are thinking about how do you monitor this program, right? So it's done very, very often by people who are internal to the organization, as opposed to evaluations, which tend to be independent external entities who come to do this. How often, what timing, monitoring is very often ongoing, that during whatever is the course of the project, we also monitor the project for the same period of time, as opposed to evaluations, which are there are specific points in time where you see that there is a need to evaluate. Though, I mean, often there is just baseline and end line. Some have midlines as well, but typically that's the distinction between monitoring evaluation in terms of when. In terms of what is the ambit of this, right? So we are trying to, in monitoring, we are trying to think about progress, right? How are we doing on what it is that we plan to do, right? So this is us sort of periodically thinking about, acha, this was the plan. So let's say you have a theory of change, you have an implementation plan written out saying we will do X number of activities in whatever this 3-month period. So this is us going and looking at what has happened to these activities, and then us also going and looking at, did you get the outputs that you wanted to get, and if there is a gap, then why the gap, right? So that's kind of the ambit of monitoring, is for us to track our progress against what we had planned. And evaluation, of course, has a much broader ambit. It will look at various aspects of it, as opposed to just how you've progressed on the activities and how do you really use it, right? So I think it, in its best way, in monitoring is used best as for you to know if this program is sort of working the way you want it. All those feedback loops that we were talking about, right? You realize these groups, in keeping the TAL context, you realize the groups you've created are maybe need to be changed. So then how do you find out these groups need to be changed? That's information that monitoring provides, right? Or you realize activities are not working, whatever you've designed, their children don't seem to be receiving it well. That information also provided by monitoring, and then you can change the activities, think of another approach. So continuous sort of program improvement is the goal of monitoring, and also management of, let's say, your human resources, management of your financial resources, right? How is the staff that you've assigned to an X, I mean, to whatever job, right? Are they able to deliver that? Do they need additional training? Are they understanding what the goals of the project are? Things like that, as well as how are you doing on, spending your financial resources? Is this being spent sort of judiciously? Things like that. So that kind of information is uh, is kind of what we get through monitoring. And larger, I mean, you think about evaluation more in terms of, should we scale up? Should we end this program? Should we, I don't know, try it in another context altogether? That's the kind of information that evaluation kind of tends to provide, right? So I think I find this distinction important, as well as sometimes confusing, because some of these aspects of monitoring could also appear as though it's part of evaluation, and some of the aspects of evaluation that we've already spoken about could also appear as being part of monitoring. But it just I think they are kind of intertwined a little bit, and we need to really think about why we're doing something for us to understand that this is part of monitoring of the program, right? I'm going back again. I think this is something that Suraj has shown several times during the previous sessions, and again, it is linear just for ease of, I think, visuals. And in the way that I there is a certain school of thought that looks at this part, what I'm calling here process monitoring, as monitoring, and this part between outputs and impact as evaluation, right? So there are certain schools of thought that do that, as well as to say all of it can be monitoring, because I think organizations want to know between outputs and outcomes and impacts as well on an ongoing basis, if possible, to see, are you making progress in the direction that you wanted, right? You may not, like if you do an ongoing monitoring, you may not see the final impact that you want immediately. But yeah, so what we will primarily focus on during this particular session, though, is this piece, is the inputs, activities, outputs piece, which which are calling process monitoring, right? Again, I don't think it's important to get really hung up on terminology, and just think of monitoring as the piece of implementation through which we find out whether the project is moving ahead in the direction that we had envisioned it, right? How did we plan for this project to happen? How do we plan for the activities to take place? How do we plan for these activities to translate into outputs? And is that going as per plan, right? Right. Sorry, I am not sure I understand. Is that Nanny? Is that your question? Sorry, there's a question in the chat that I'm not quite sure I understand.
I mean, I was just making a comment when you said that sometimes we don't understand whether this question is a whether this question is a part of evaluation or monitoring stage. So I was just agreeing with your point over there.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. I saw it later, and then it didn't make sense to me without the context.
Yeah,
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a concern, of course, but I think, like I was saying, it's important not to get hung up on terminology so much as to see what is this information going to help you with, right? And the way that makes it really simple for me to think about is that monitoring helps me improve my program while it's being implemented, right? And evaluation kind of tends to happen after a certain chunk of work has been done, and then you make decisions based on the evaluation, basically because of the kind of timelines within which evaluation happens, right?
that is an excellent distinction, actually.
Yeah, and yeah, agree with Suraj about designing, right? So monitoring is typically something that we do after implementation has commenced. And design is evaluated, of course, and we've spoken about how you evaluate design as well. Right. I think I like to think about monitoring in kind of these 4 steps. First is really to think about, why do we want to monitor this, right? And to really focus our energies on the why do we want to monitor it, because in any context that I have seen monitoring happen, or I have been part of monitoring teams, or monitoring plans have been presented to me, things like that, we often get caught up in some very basic, easy to measure things, and because it's important to monitor, right? But I think it's really critical for us to think about, why do we want to monitor this program, right? Like, which aspect, there will be some aspects of this that we're maybe to begin with concerned about, or we think we don't know how this is going to pan out, or we want to keep something tight. I mean, keeping implementation tight, I suppose, is our goal in general, but to identify the focus of monitoring becomes quite important, because given limited resources, limited time, all of that, you cannot monitor everything. So you need to focus on which aspects of this do I want to monitor and why do I want to monitor these aspects, right? And then there is, of course, the next step of developing indicators and targets. Targets, yes, no, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But in my thinking of this, if you were to have outputs, right? If a theory of change is written out with a decent amount of detail, then you do list out some targets, right? In the sense of we want to have one training a month or one training every quarter, or that's kind of a target that you've set yourself in designing the implementation plan that flows from your theory of change. So you have to develop indicators and targets, sometimes targets not so much, but indicators for sure, right? And then it's critical to also make sure that these are aligned to the activities or the outputs that you are thinking about in the program. Like, and we'll come to that. I think we'd spend a large part of today's session actually just talking about indicators and how do we make sure indicators are appropriate for the activities and things like. It does sound extremely basic as I say it, and as I say it to a group of people who've been implementing, designing, implementing, monitoring programs for a while. It does sound like a very basic thing to spend time on. Like, how do you identify indicators that are appropriate to the activities that you have planned? But I find that it's important to sit down and think about it, because sometimes we do this in a very default sort of whatever comes easily approach. So I think it makes sense to sit down and think about it. And then once you've defined what the indicators are, then we need to start thinking about how do you collect this data, what tools do you use, who do you talk to, where do you collect this information from, right? So once you know what you're going to monitor, then we start thinking about how you're going to monitor this, right? What is the most appropriate approach to getting this? What is feasible in the context that you're working in, right? We might have a very well thought out idea of how to collect data, collect it, participatorily, everybody sort of contributes to this, things like that. But what is feasible in your context, in the timelines that you have, and with the human resource that you have, then who's going to do what, right? This is also an important aspect of thinking about monitoring, is how many parts of this and how do you sort of give responsibilities in terms of monitoring. What is the frequency with which you want to monitor? Is it what activities are monitored at what frequency? All of this is really variable based on what the program plans were. But all of this needs to be thought about when we think about our monitoring plans, right? So we'll talk about mostly 1 and 2. 3 and 4 will come in subsequent sessions, where we will really delve into what are the different tools and methods available, and how do we find ones that suit us and our skills and our time. Right. Also, why do we want to monitor, right? That's another sort of important aspect. And like I said before, I think for me, in the way that I think about monitoring, it is for us to see broadly, is the program moving forward in the way that we wanted it to, right? Is the population, whoever you wanted to target, are they receiving what you intended to, whatever the intended services were, right? So there are two, if you look at that statement, there are two aspects to it. One is whether it's going to the right people, in the sense the people that you wanted to serve through the program, and if they are getting the intended service. You might have wanted to do X thing. Are they getting that aspect only, right? So that's one of the key sort of ways to think about what are you, I mean, why do you monitor? Because you want to know whether the people that you originally planned to serve are getting the thing that you originally planned to give them, right? Whether it's goods or services. In our context, it mostly tends to be services. But the two things that we need to look at in that one statement are the people as well as the service, right? And the second thing is if they're provided in the manner that you imagined it, right? If you wanted to, how did you imagine this training would happen? And is it actually happening in that way, right? Both in terms of frequency, how often did you think about delivering a training program, as well as how did you imagine having to deliver that program, and what exactly translates to when you're doing the training, right? So I'm just using this example of training for us to think about this. But yeah, but any service that we intended to provide as part of the program, any program intervention that was expected to happen, both timing of the intervention, how often did we think about it, and how did we imagine delivering it, right? Is that quality something that's being maintained as well? Yeah. And then, of course, there is the question of accountability, right? Lots of programs are delivered very far away from sometimes where our offices are. We only have like limited time in which to see whether the staff that have been given their jobs to do are actually able to deliver these jobs. If there is anything in terms of our sort of training that needs to be changed, if there's anything in terms of human resource, just numbers, quantity, what kind of resources are you able to find, and how do you have to then tweak the program to think about this is the kind of skill set that you're working with, or you have to think about let's train people more, or you see people have not understood what exactly they were supposed to do. All of these pieces of information often comes to you from monitoring of programs, right? Right. And I think this is something that I kind of I end up having this conversation, this back and forth, this dilemma that's here with several people in several different contexts about, do you measure, what do you measure, and should you measure, right? There's a whole school of thought that says you don't go into a classroom and observe the teacher teaching the children. That relationship is sacred. You don't observe it. You don't put it in a checklist and then say whether this teacher is good or bad. And then there's things about how often do you measure learning outcomes. Is that way of measuring learning outcomes correct? What if you don't measure other things that they may have learned, but they've not learned English or something like that, right? So this is for me a big dilemma with measurement that I encounter in talking to people who are implementing. Honestly speaking, I come a little bit on the left side of things. I think you can't manage what you don't measure. But also, I do think it's important to think about what you measure and how often you measure it, right? Because it is also true that you can't fatten the cow by just continuously weighing the cow. You have to allow for time to do things to the cow for it to put on weight, let's say. That's what we're talking about. So, and I think it's useful to think about this in terms of monitoring before because our tendency is to just say, let's monitor everything, right? Let's monitor everything, and then let's collect all this monitoring data, and then we don't necessarily know what we're doing with the data. So it's really important to think about what it is you're measuring and why you're measuring it and how you're going to use that information before you decide, I'm going to monitor these things, right? Exactly. I mean, I kind of agree with Seema, but there is, I mean, I think that measuring is important for us to sort of know where we stand, and to see if we can do better than what we're doing in the program itself, right? Because often, as we've spoken about in the previous sessions, there are things about the context that we don't realize till we start implementing. And you may find that something is just not going the way that you want, because of contextual reasons. And you should have the opportunity to change that, right? And monitoring does provide that kind of information about activities, so that, yeah. Like I said, I do fall on the left side of things. I like to measure, yeah. But I do understand also the the apprehension with too much focus on measurement, let's say. Is the general sort of approach in Vikramshila measure, or is it don't weigh the fattened cow so much?
I'd say it's
Intermittent and only the
measure.
important part. Sorry,
Sorry.
Navrata.
Sorry,
Sorry,
say that again.
Seema. It is measure. It's
Okay.
I think from the very beginning the idea is how much has happened, what has happened. Let's see. It's just that I think we lack the resources, the tools, and the capability to do a good job of it. I think we have come a long way from what we were like 10 years back, but we are never really satisfied. But yes, I think the narrative is pushing us to do. To work more around this area. But the intent is always there to measure more towards the left. Yeah.
Also, Pritya, I think that some programs, the nature of the program actually limits the scope to measure each and everything. So we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence which arrives from the field, and that evidence is often very heartening, but then we can't really quantify it or measure it in a sense of, we can't give numbers, we can't award numbers to that. So we do
Sure.
tend to work a lot with qualitative data to provide that provide that evidence to somebody who asks us about our programs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we will probably come, I mean, we will come to it slightly later, this conversation on quantitative, qualitative measurement, but we do live in a world currently, or at least the world I inhabit is currently a very quant heavy world. We like data to be, monitoring data, even evaluation data actually to be quantifiable.
Quantifiable.
You want progress to be quantified in numbers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that qualitative aspects cannot be measured or should not be measured. It's just there's a certain bias in terms of also what's easy to do. If you ask me, honestly speaking, it's much easier in my head to um, measure things quantitatively that can be done, as opposed to trying to delve into, let's do this, let's find out qualitatively what's going on. And that may be the reason people defer to the former a bit more, especially donors and things. It's just easier, right, to look at. And I mean, like it or not, there's a lot of bias about numbers being the truth,
Yeah.
and qualitative being perceptions, being opinions, things like that. But that, I mean, honestly, I don't think is true. Because I mean, I want to take an example. This is an impact evaluation, unfortunately, and not a monitoring, but still about how quantitative was grossly insufficient. In one of the programs that we were just evaluating, there was tablets given to, like these tablets being electronic tablets given to children during COVID school closures in order to help them access online classes, right? So they were given the tablets, they were given free internet connections. They just had to buy a SIM, internet recharge was done by us, things like that. And they had the tablets with them for 6 months, right? zero monitoring was done. We did no monitoring at all. So we have no idea what happened in those 6 months other than the data we have from the usage of this particular application we wanted them to use on the app, right? So we only know that in terms of ongoing monitoring data. And at the end of this, we find out that in terms of what we wanted them to improve, which is how they were doing in language and math, children had done, like there was a negative impact on their learning, right? Now, everything else that we can think about this is speculation. We're saying maybe they used it for YouTube, maybe they used it to watch movies, maybe they played games, all of this. But had we done any process monitoring, all of this would have been much clearer to us, right? And had we done any qualitative, even in the end of the impact, I mean, at the end of the program impact evaluation, if we had done some qualitative piece, then we would have heard more about what had happened instead of just measuring the one thing that we cared about, which was learning outcomes, right? So it could, I mean, it appears as though this was bad for the children, but we're still in no position to say anything valuable about why, and if you were to do it again, how should you change this thing, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think quant gets more time in the sunlight, but it's really important to think about the qualitative aspect as well, right?
Is this the MindSpark project? I'm sorry if I'm missing the name a little. MindSpark, right?
Yeah, it is. The paper's not yet out though, but I know that the results are out. So yeah. I mean, MindSpark in a school context has worked very, very well in large scale settings, but in this individual context, it didn't really work. And honestly speaking, it has nothing to do with MindSpark. It is something else that's operating in the context that we've not been able to capture, which was causing this problem. We are fairly sure it's not MindSpark actually.
Yeah, no, I completely agree in this respect, because see, sometimes there are also these things, for example, say social emotional learning, which actually draws a lot of global and even in the Indian context, it's drawing a lot of attention. So suppose you run a module on empathy, and end of the module you can ask some pointed questions, some smart questions as well to the respondents, but then there is no way to actually assess what is their understanding of empathy, what is their practice of empathy post that program.
Sure.
So in that sense, monitoring indicator focusing only on numbers, the outreach, the population, the target population, that gives us some numbers, but not the whole story.
Absolutely, right? So you'll end up saying X people attended the training. And you can also go to X people successfully completed the training. And that you could possibly even define qualitatively, right? What does completing training mean? They came for, some number of sessions. They did they did the activities, whatever, they participated in the class somehow. So all of that you could possibly have a bit more sort of qualitative depth, but still what have they taken away from it is not something that you can easily measure in numbers. And also maybe not something that you can easily measure right after the training as well, right? Because you might have to observe them for a longer period of time, and which is why when you monitor which indicator is also important. Maybe immediately you just do kitne log aaye and how many of them attended the training, and take some kind of feedback from them in terms of what they thought of the training, right? So that's probably the extent to which you can do it immediately. But of course you want to know whether, because your outcome, I'm assuming, is greater empathy or things like that, which probably you measure at a later point, Yeah. There's actually, sorry, this is a digression, but I think about it often. There's this approach that people use primarily in sort of mental health evaluation programs, which is called this knowledge, skills, and attitude. There's a framework, right? And it's because you can measure possibly knowledge immediately after the training. You can possibly, if the training was supposed to give you some skills, you can possibly measure that even like to a certain extent, you can measure it after the training. But attitude change is something that you don't often expect to happen immediately, right? So that approach is sometimes taken to measure how much have people, how much value have people derived from training. Sometimes I think you'll find enough on the internet about it. It's used mostly, at least in my experience, in this kind of segment, in socio-emotional learning as part of education, or in mental health programs, things like that. Sorry, I'm just going to go to the chat. Yeah, like we are saying, yeah. It is, that framework is quite popular for very qualitative measurement. Yeah, I will send links out about, this knowledge, skills, and attitude. Correct. And yeah, we just, sorry. Sorry, Suresh, do you want to come in or anything? I'm just reading that there's quite a bit happening on the chat. I'm not sure everyone's reading. So if you want to come in verbally on something.
Yeah, I'm just afraid you need to, you have a bunch of things to finish, because this quant qual thing, there's a lot. Well, okay, I can briefly say what I just put in the chat box, but briefly is that often the things that we need to measure, which are counts, and the example, such as number of students who attended a session or number of sessions which were conducted. But we also often want to know something about the quality or some other aspect which is a non-count thing, right? We want to know how many attended and how well they attended. Now, the moment we say that, we have to figure out how to do it. So it's not immediately a count. So we have to come up with some way of measure, some qualitative thing, which often can take a quantitative form, right? We can say, oh, we're going to say 1, 2, 3 in terms of, degree of engagement, but that's derived through a qualitative thing. So I think the real discussion has to be about the non-count, because the counts are needed. So it's the non-count where I think this debate is more relevant. Yeah.
Right. So emotions and experiences are actually something which are non-count, as Suraj says, right?
Yeah.
So what we have started doing in our organization is that we have started using a Likert scale to actually capture some of these. So you rate from 1 to 5 whether it makes you feel happy or sad.
Right.
Right. So that is one way to quantify qualitative observations, not complete, but it does help in some way.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I have my problems with the Likert scale, mostly because if I was given a Likert scale, I always sit on 3 in the middle of this, and I think a lot of people, I mean, we once used it in about a sample of about 19-20,000 people. It was like 90 to 93% had landed on the 3, and it told us nothing, right? It told us nothing valuable. So of course the desire or the inclination to quantify makes it easier for us to process this information, let's say, more than anything else. But there are several approaches like the one you just mentioned, Nani, of obtaining qualitative information, but having it available in a quantitative fashion so that you can analyze it quantitatively a little bit, right? Yeah. I think though it's sad that it is mutually excluded, like what Ratna was saying, it does often happen that it's either you do one quantitative thing and you don't do qual at all, or the other way around, right? Those schools of thought really don't very much talk to each other, which is something that I think as implementers, we have the we are in a position to try and influence that a little bit. So yeah. Case studies are a good way to capture qualitative. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So in terms of um, what indicators can really be, right? They're just intended to be things that help us recognize whether an activity or an outcome has happened in the way that we'd imagined it, right? Because all of this has to be in the background of us. How did we plan for this, right? So a monitoring indicator is supposed to help us sort of compare what has happened to what we had planned will happen. So we need to have indicators at the time of implementation planning itself, right? So when we say we're going to do this activity at this particular time as part of the implementation plan, we also need to have a monitoring indicator next to it about how do we get information about whether this activity or this output has actually taken place in the way that we are planning it, right? Um, I think, I mean, we've already discussed a little bit, they can be qualitative or quantitative, and that measurement can be done qualitatively or quantitatively, right? That doesn't mean that you only qualitatively measure a qualitative indicator. Like the example that
Yeah.
Nani just gave, it was trying to put quantitative measures to what is a quality indicator as such, right? Right. I think, 1 second. I think I'm all, so we are going to do a large part of today is going to be you all sort of working on indicators. Sorry, excuse me. Um, so I think I
It's your
just have a
chai
bit,
break.
yeah, just a bit more to go. Give me like 5 minutes and then we take a break. This is just, I think Suraj and I spoke. Sorry, Namrata, you want to say something?
Yeah, actually wanted to go back to the last slide, and I had a question from my like current experience. So I was thinking of asking this question before also, but I thought that I'll wait for the indicator slide. So as you mentioned that people like don't invest enough in planning the indicators. So they put in the indicators they already know or they assume to know. So for example, we have a project which is around the first 1,000 days, and generally in first 1,000 days people are more focused on nutrition and health, and they're not much focused on the responsive care or the learning opportunities. But our project is on that. So what happened a lot when we were working on our MEL plan and writing down the indicators, that a lot of health and nutrition indicators came out from the other technical team who was helping us in that. So my question is that now, because our primary goal is to work on the responsive care and the early learning opportunities. So but it will be done through those health and nutrition aspects as well. So do we have indicators at two level, these are our primary indicators and then secondary? Is there anything like any such thing in this process, or shall we include all the indicators, because that will make our job very extensive? And that is something which I was like thinking again for the last couple of months. And because I am myself not coming from health and nutrition background, so I don't give them like much weightage, but then I know the importance, and hence I want to keep them in the program. So when we actually plan indicators and when we are kind of finalizing it, what are the questions we should have in mind to finalize them, so that it should not be a personal choice or a person's experience, it should be a program choice and a program experience. So are there any specific questions, like you shared us in monitoring that there are certain questions that we can ask ourselves? So yeah.
I think very good question, and often because there are various approaches to the same outcome, right? You can take different sets of approaches to the same outcome, and like you're saying, there is a totally different lens with which to look at the program you're doing altogether, right? So there is either you use the health and nutrition lens, or you use the the responsive care and parenting, that lens. So I think I would, in the way that I would imagine this, I would think about what do I see as the program's role, right? There could be things that it's outside your influence. You're not able to influence some things. And if there aren't any activities that are working in health and nutrition, for example, then you're not going to gain very much value from having indicators that are about those aspects. So the one thing that I would say is, I mean, at this point, what I can think about is that you tie up indicators to your activities. They have to align with your activities. Anything happens in the health and nutrition space that you're not actually intervening in, and that may be, something that is a consequence of something you've done, but you did not intend for that to happen. I mean, not to say it's an unintended consequence, it's going to happen, but this is outside the purview of what I would like to measure, right? Because there are so many things that can happen as part of, even if you think about it, it's a very simple education. I'm going to train the teacher on X subject program. There are several things that can happen as part of the training that were not in the plan. So you can only plan indicators for activities that you have planned, right?
Yes.
So, and if you want to use the health and nutrition lens, then see if you can have activities that will further those outcomes. I mean, help collect actual information on that. Yeah.
And as Suraj mentioned, this is actually a program which is like highly influenced by the government.
Yeah.
So government always like pushes in the health and nutrition indicators, even if we don't intend to incorporate them in a project. So that is why I was like very concerned to see how can we actually plan it out, and is there any specific way to go about it? Is there already something available for that? So, but
I mean, there's little theory about monitoring. There isn't a lot of accepted, let's say, this is the way to go about this approach. And I think just in my experience in working with government, sometimes it's easiest to give them a little bit of what they want, right? So that they can let you do the rest of what you want to do in peace, right? And typically the things that government wants to monitor are, let's say, easier to catch and tend to be things that will show them in a good light if they're doing well, right? So so I would say there is part of it is thinking about it from program perspective alone, but part of it is also thinking about, I have to now deliver this program in partnership with government for these many years, and how do I negotiate that conversation, right? So we don't want to monitor everything, which will be hard, but can you give them something so that they
absolutely they should feel interested also to
exactly
kind of
that's part of what you want from them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sorry, have we really? Okay, let's take the break then. Let's take this break. So we're on 5:37. Can we be back by 5:45? Is that okay? Because we have a bit of an activity to do in groups, and I would like at least 30 minutes if possible. So 5:45?
Sure.
Should I assume everyone's here and start? Right. So I think in terms of extending what we were just talking about with respect to qualitative and quantitative indicators and the tension between these two sort of ways of collecting data as well as kinds of data that you collect, I think it's really possible to expand the way that we think in terms of what we think is qualitative. I mean, what we think about qualitative data and what we think about quantitative uh, data, and like just let's say we like this is a very basic sort of rudimentary examples of how you can do um, both quantitative and qualitative things differently. So let's say you can like okay, let's start with this. So quantitative indicators sort of analyzed or measured quantitatively, right? So this is essentially easy counting numbers kind of thing. What is the student enrollment rate? What is the dropout rate? Things like we were talking about right now. How many people came to the training? How many trainings did you conduct? So this is quantitative, measured quantitatively, or analyzed quantitatively as well, right? So by counting how many children attended, you're not able to say anything about the quality of the session as such. You're just saying these many people came to the session, and then you're saying these many trainings were conducted, right? And then there is qualitative indicators measured or analyzed qualitatively, right? So you get like a focus group of parents, you sit down and talk to them about what do you think about girl child education. You write these down descriptively, um, and if you like, don't go into aspects of X percentage of parents thought this. If you were to do that, that is analyzing qualitative data quantitatively. You can still possibly do that, right? And then quantitative indicators, which at least at the face of it appear quantitative, right? Like a language score. Right? It looks like it's a quantitative indicator. You can give children a score. You can give every question in the test a 0 or a 1 or a whatever, however you decide to score it. And then that could be a purely quantitative sort of an indicator, a measure, or it could also be something that you analyze qualitatively, right? In terms of how is comprehension? How are you measuring their ability to communicate? I mean, has because of language learning, what is the sort of qualitative change? How have they qualitatively learned the language, right? Instead of just saying because they got 80 on 100 in the test, this means they have learned English, that kind of thing. And there's qualitative indicators which can be measured or analyzed quantitatively as well, right? I mean, the example I use here is percentage of teachers using learner-centric methods shared in the training. So you will define qualitatively what these learner-centric approaches are. How did you use them in the training? And then when you see how many teachers are meeting this criteria, it's a qualitative measure, right? Because this is measuring quality of training, quality of teaching in the classroom. You will probably do it using some kind of classroom observation tool or some kind of conversations with the children, things like that. And then, of course, you can quantitatively analyze it by putting numbers to the measures that you've looked at, right?
So, can I give an example here, Vidya? So, I was working on this project with a couple of linguists, and what one of the tools that we designed was we took a story in picture format, and there was an audio input as well. So that story was probably we made the children watch the story and hear the story, 2 minute story in, say, English. And then after the story, we asked them to retell the story to us. And then we asked them like a couple of questions, comprehension related questions per story. And the questions were quantitatively analyzed, whether it was the right response or not. But even there, sometimes the response of a child was not yes or no, but a higher order thinking. It implied a higher order thinking. And there were no clear guidelines on that also. But we marked those questions. So just trying to tell you that this process is so complex, right? And then the story bit, which was retold by them, we use those qualitative inputs and we extracted, say, suppose this child has used like 5 adjectives, this child has used like 6 emotive terms, the verb usage, the grammatical correctness, and based on all of that, so that was an example of actually analyzing quantitatively what was observed, what was the data which was qualitative in nature. But overall, I think this process is so complex that it does require a lot of, you know, it requires a lot of subjectivity on part of the researcher, the field investigator also, or somebody who's scoring the sheets. Yeah, that's it.
Exactly.
Vidya, you're
If
on
you're
mute.
trying to
Yeah.
quantify what is a qualitative indicator, right? Sorry, Seema, you wanted to say something?
No, I was saying you were on mute.
Yeah. No, so yeah, in something that we think of, sorry, as a quantitative indicator, typically learning outcomes are often considered a quantitative indicator, which you've just, as Neni has described, is measured so qualitatively here, right? You're going into the depths of how, what do you call comprehension, the retelling of the story, things like that, as opposed to giving them uh read a story, write the answers, correct, yes, no, that kind of quantitatively also this can be done, right? But I think also an important point that that is being raised from the example that you gave, Lenny, is that we need to really be careful about what we monitor based on what kind of resources we have, right? You might want to monitor at that depth, and it might be hugely valuable to the program, but if it is impossible to do in the time span that you have, or with the kind of skills you have in the team, if it becomes hard for this to become a reality on the field, then I'm not sure that it is, we spend all this time designing these indicators really, really well, and we don't have the ability to actually implement them, then it becomes, complex. So it's a kind of give and take between what can we reliably do and what is the best way of measuring this thing, right? Exactly. Yeah. Right. I mean, I tend to get some flack for using this abbreviation. It's used a lot in a lot of places, but I like that thinking of uh, indicators this way helps us sort of clarify in our heads, right? That we need to think about what exactly are you measuring, like what exactly will be achieved, you know? Is it, let's say, for example, trainings conducted? If that is, it's as simple as that, that's easy. You need to know exactly what you're uh, measuring. And then, like we were talking just now, is it possible to reliably collect this data? And do you have the expertise, time, and staff to collect this data, right? So, like it's been shared on the chat by several of you, it was time consuming to collect, time consuming to analyze, as well as let's say another aspect that Lenny raised, which is there's some level of subjectivity to this, right? So based on who is collecting this data, or who is analyzing this data, or who is scoring the sheets, like you were saying, you might get some degree of subjectivity. So is the data you're collecting reliable, and are you able to sort of, do you have the time, staff, expertise to collect this, right? And then when you're thinking about a particular expectation from the program, right, is it realistic to expect that this will get met in the time frame, right? Let's say 3 month monitoring, we want to do monthly training with teachers in the government school, right? And I think the reason I'm going to this example is because I find that is the thing that very often breaks down when you're trying to um, get dates from governments for training, things like that. And you think monthly ek to ho jayega. And then they will tell you in the beginning, government will say monthly ek ho jayega. But by the time you get permission for first month training, it's too late to do the second month training. And then everything spills over based on that, right? So and then if your indicator is you will do one training every month, then you're setting yourself up to not meet that indicator, right? So is it realistic to achieve in the timeline that you've given yourself? And then this is the thing that we were discussing. The indicator has to be relevant to the activity or to the output that you're thinking about. Is it going to capture the change that you want to track, right? So that is something that, again, it sounds extremely basic, but it's something that often our indicators, I mean, it's confusing, especially if you're trying to capture something that's quite complex and not as easy as how many trainings have you done, right? So then you have to really make sure that the indicator captures what you're trying to change. And then it has to be clearly specified by when, right? By when will this thing happen? So let's say you're saying something like 30% of teachers will start using student-centric practices in the class, something like that. But by when? By the end of year 1, by the end of 6 months, whatever that is, that needs to be clearly part of your indicator, right? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Is it something that's actually reliably measurable given all the constraints that we have? Is it realistic to expect that this change will happen in whatever time frame we are imagining it? Importantly, does the indicator capture that particular change that you want? And you have to clearly say by when this change is expected to happen, or this activity is supposed to be completed, right? So yeah, I find that way of thinking, like if once I write an indicator, I find this way of looking at these 5 things to see, am I kind of close to what needs to be done for an indicator? I find it useful when I'm writing indicators, which is why I kind of brought it up here. And then I think the question of also, what do we do with monitoring information, right? If you're monitoring too many things, if you're collecting data too often, if there's too many programs happening and the same people are monitoring, then often monitoring becomes routine. You do end up doing the monitoring, but the analysis of the monitoring data and the information that it can provide to us in terms of how to change this program for the better, we don't have time to do that because it's time for the next round of monitoring, right? So I think it's important to know what our availability is in terms of resources, in terms of how much you can monitor, so that you don't lose the more critical aspect of using this to change the program, and also to identify things that are going well, possibly that you didn't imagine would happen, right? So it's a good way you need to make sure that your monitoring plan gives you time to analyze and to make course corrections before another round of monitoring needs to happen, right? And yeah, I think given that we've been talking about participatory approaches in design, even in thinking about how do you implement, I find this area of monitoring is something that several organizations take on in terms of trying to do it participatively, right? Sorry, I'm just going to answer Seema's question. Should you ignore what you cannot change about the program? I think maybe try and if it's going badly and you cannot change it, maybe try and introduce something that will reduce the problem that this thing is causing. I mean, and in terms of monitoring, I think we should be able to change intervention if possible. If it's in your hand, if it's a social process context thing that is having an impact on your program and you can't change it, then you just try to address it through another program. I mean, through another activity or intervention. If you've learned that something is coming in the way, then you should try and do something about it as far as possible. Right. So in terms of sort of monitoring participatorily, right? So, and I think this is done far more often in this space, in the monitoring space, than it gets done in the design phase. So can you design indicators in a participatory manner, right? Can you include other people other than your the core design team or the core implementation team in thinking about indicators, right? Because there may be a certain way of thinking about this that is ingrained in how the organization works, right? So can you get teachers involved? Can you get children involved? Can you get community involved in thinking about what should we monitor here? What is going to tell us how we are progressing? Can we expand the group of people who monitor? Can we have other people other than core program staff monitor the program, right? Yeah, can you do this in a more participatory manner? Can you include more people in trying to make meaning out of monitoring data and analysis? This is something that very often is restricted to a small group of people who analyze data and try to see what the insights are from this data. And I think this aspect will benefit hugely from sort of slightly expanding who is looking at this data and how they're going to analyze it, right? And of course, also, are there any other ways that we can think of that we can incorporate participation in uh, monitoring, right? So I think this is something that
Specifically, while working with governments, it's the factor that what is in it for me.
Yeah.
Right. If a commissioner or a district head or a DPO, whoever, he wants to know something which he can highlight, right? So it empowers them to get that data, or it becomes easy for us to take it across.
Definitely, yeah. And I think they would, to a certain extent, be willing to monitor alongside you as well if that data is going to help them. So yeah, I think in one of the programs that I'm currently working on, it's a large scale implementation spread across all districts in a state, and we're thinking very actively about how can we get government to help us design and monitor, design indicators and help us monitor, because it's completely infeasible for program staff to be everywhere. I mean, it came out of a necessity thought more than let's make this participatory thought, but I think there is much value to the insights of people who are who are receiving program interventions in them monitoring it as opposed to us doing it exclusively as people who are actually delivering the intervention. Right. Okay. So what we're going to do, I think, right, okay, we have a decent amount of time. What we're going to do, if someone can make me host or just randomly split us into 3 groups, then I'm going to share this. Actually, the folder on Google Drive that we have for the course already has the 3 slides uploaded from the activity that we are going to do right now. I'm just going to share, just give me 1 second, the link.
You're the host now. So
okay, wonderful. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to share the link in this chat here so that everyone has access to it. I have uploaded this presentation on the shared Google Drive that we all use, right? So I'm just going to make split us up into 3 groups, and you will get one scenario each, right? This has been picked up directly from what you all have submitted as part of your theory of change, in terms of constructing the theory of change, right? So there were, give me 1 second to just share. Yeah. Right. So this is one of the submissions that we had on. This is the approach that they are using, and the person who has written this theory of change has come up with these activities. I have not pulled out, a lot of you all have listed a lot of activities, right? I've not pulled out all of them. I've just pulled out a few of the activities and a few of the outputs. And there are 3 such scenarios, right, which are all coming from, what you all have shared. So the goal for this, the next, let's say 20 minutes, is to think about indicators for these activities and these outputs, these activities or these outputs, however far we go with them, right? So we will start working on this right now. And hopefully we will have like a minute or so for each team to share what they've come up with. And then you will continue to work on it in the same groups in the coming week, right? So that's the plan. So I just sent the link, so everybody should be able to access the slides on our Google Drive. I'll just make groups. Apparently, I don't seem to have the ability to make groups, even though I am the host. How is this possible? Oh, sorry. No, just forgotten. 3 breakout rooms. Yeah, I think you should have received invites.